Promoting a diverse workforce in both the public and private sectors has long been a passion of mine. I believe we can best promote our interests, be they in the national interest or in a company's interest, by bringing the most diverse voices and perspectives to the table. The moral case for diversity is clear. Our nation's highest ideals demand we strive to promote equal rights and opportunities. That's why, for example, over the years, my personal office has conducted several surveys of America's top companies, the Fortune 100 companies, to evaluate the state of diversity in their corporate boardrooms and executive suites. And when I talk to business leaders, I always make it a point to emphasize that cultivating a diverse workforce isn't just about our values. Research shows that diversity is also good for the bottom line. For example, a 2018 Boston Consulting Group study found that fostering a more diverse workforce ultimately yields more innovation and better outcomes. Simply put, diversity is a competitive advantage in the corporate world. And today I'm here to say that the same goes for government, and especially when it comes to military, diplomatic, and foreign affairs. The men and women of our State Department are, in essence, the face of America to the rest of the world. And I believe the diversity of our citizens is an inspiration to people across the globe, especially those living in countries whose governments choose to prevent 10 or even 50% of their population from even participating in the workforce. So yes, we have a moral obligation to ensure that the doors of our national security bureaucracy are open to all who wish to serve, regardless of race, gender, sexuality, religion, or any other minority status. But there is also a more narrow and hard-nosed set of national security considerations. Simply put, a more diverse workforce operates and generates better policy options and makes better policy decisions. Throughout my 28 years in the House and Senate working on U.S. foreign policy, I have seen firsthand the role that diversity plays in strengthening our military, diplomatic, and foreign assistance efforts, and how a lack of diversity can hinder the experiences, ideas, and options that we as a nation can draw on. In the 21st century, I believe diversity must be treated as a strategic imperative at the State Department. Consider the complex challenges that we face. Whether we are confronting a revanchist Russia, a rising China, terrorism and extremism, global health and migration, cybersecurity, or climate change, solving today's multifaceted global challenges demands more varied viewpoints and experiences than ever before. That's why my colleagues and I requested the Government Accountability Office undertake a comprehensive look at diversity and inclusion at the State Department. The results, unfortunately, show that despite some laudable efforts, the Department of State has yet to cultivate the kind of diverse and representative national security workforce that we need. Indeed, the results of the GAO study find that while the overall proportion of underrepresented minorities at the Department of State as a whole has grown somewhat between 2002 and 2018, they still only make up 32% of the department, having grown only 4% over the past 16 years. 4% over 16 years. Most of the time that I've been in Congress, I've been promoting and either passing legislation or holding different secretaries of state accountable for the question of diversity at the State Department, in the Foreign Service, as well as the broader universe. And I look at this and I say 4% over 16 years. Just simply not acceptable. Even more troubling, that figure is only 24% within the Foreign Service. The GAO also found that Asians and Hispanics represent only 6 and 7%, respectively, of the department's workforce. And Native Americans are hardly represented in Foreign Service at all. Despite the proportion of African American representation has actually decreased, disturbingly, I should say, the proportion of African American representation has actually decreased in the past decade and a half to just 15%, comprising just 7% of the Foreign Service. Likewise, representation of women in the department has changed only marginally in 15 years, with women comprising just 35% of the Foreign Service. In other words, we are woefully behind in our efforts to achieve gender parity, and I cannot imagine that the president's demonization of outstanding female diplomats like Ambassador Yovanovitch bodes well for recruitment. Finally, and perhaps unsurprisingly, at the very top of the State Department, white individuals make up 87% of executives, and 67% of those executives are male. These numbers have barely budged since 2002, when white individuals made up 88% of executives, only 1% higher than what the figure stands today, 18 years later. Well, I've said it before and I'll say it again, whether we're talking about the boardrooms of the Fortune 500 or the upper echelons of government, in a nation as diverse as ours, something is wrong when most of those occupying our most powerful positions are overwhelmingly male and overwhelmingly pale. To be clear, it's not just that the State Department has work to do. What today's GAO report tells us is that by the numbers, the State Department remains less diverse than the rest of the entire federal government, which is true since when I began raising this issue 28 years ago when I came to the House of Representatives. It is still the worst of all of the federal departments instead of diversity after nearly 3 decades of effort. That's a problem. And the American people deserve, and our national security demands, a Department of State that reflects the full richness of our citizens. We must harness all of the American people's ideas, skills, knowledge, cultural perspectives, diasporic connections, linguistic backgrounds, and experiences to assure the success of the department's mission, and ultimately to build a safer, more stable, and more prosperous world. That's why this week I will be introducing the State Department Inclusivity Act of 2020 to encourage the Department of State to develop new recruitment, retention, and promotion strategies and mechanisms to grow and maintain a more diverse workforce. My legislation will also recognize the wrongful termination of state employees in the 1950s and 60s for alleged homosexuality and require the department to convene senior-level boards to address the issues faced by the LGBTQIA community. To be honest, had we been having this discussion 3 years ago, I've told you that there were challenges, but that we might be making progress, and that legislation of this sort might no longer be necessary. That change was coming, and it was irreversible. This was not a legislative fight that I expected to need to have in 2020 in the third decade of the new century. Unfortunately, given where we are in our current political and cultural moment, with a president who openly tolerates intolerance and whose rhetoric of hate and divisiveness has become the new national normal for all too many, the time is ripe for taking up such a cause. Some of you may recall during President Trump's first year in office, we witnessed an appalling effort to end the State Department's Pickering, Rangel, and Payne fellowships. It was only when I, along with a number of my colleagues, stood up and fought back that we were able to preserve these crucial pipelines for the recruitment and development of diverse talent. But keeping pipelines open is only half the battle. We must actively work to build institutions and workplace environments that welcome and take full advantage of the talents that all our people have in meaningful ways, and that nurture and support those underrepresented groups as they climb the ladder to occupy senior positions across our government. That's why the State Inclusivity Act is all about strategically capitalizing on the diversity that makes America exceptional to the benefit of our foreign policy and national security. And its passage would undoubtedly send an important message to this and future administrations that Congress believes that developing and maintaining a diverse workforce at the State Department is vital to the success of American foreign policy. So let me close simply by saying diversity is one of America's defining strengths. It is one of our greatest assets as a nation. The halls of Congress bear the inscription, E pluribus unum, out of many we are one. This ethos must always be part of our story, including the one we tell to the rest of the world. Moreover, when we want our national security leaders to reflect America's best self to the world and to inspire others to follow our example, not simply by preaching pluralism and tolerance, but by practicing it. When America leads with our values on display, and I'll give you one example of this. I was in China, and our person at the embassy in charge of, in the political section on human rights and democracy, was an African American who had in fact been part of the struggles here in America for voting rights and civil rights. And his personal experience talking to Chinese dissidents about this as an American experience, but one that was universal in terms of its application, is a powerful message to others in the world. Now, I'm not saying that someone who wasn't African American couldn't have talked about that and made the case, but the power of someone who came from the struggle here in the State Department and the Foreign Service talking about dissidents and human rights activists in China was powerful beyond belief. Just one of the many examples we see across the globe. So when America leads with our values on display, whether we are promoting human rights abroad or helping resolve conflicts to help societies heal and move forward, it should be done with personnel who reflect the entire rich tapestry of the United States. So I'm going to continue fighting to change this. I feel safe in saying that my colleagues who are going to be coming in here today to talk to you and who join me in this effort are going to continue to focus on this issue and to work with all of you for further action. So I appreciate you all being here. I appreciate the distinguished panel you're going to shortly hear from, who's going to add on to our conversation here today. But before you hear from them, I want to welcome to the podium a colleague of mine who has stood hand to hand in combat with me on these issues, who cares about diversity in our State Department and the Foreign Service, and who sees it as a powerful tool of America, not a challenge, the senior senator from Maryland, Ben Cardin.
Well, good afternoon. First, I know Senator Menendez is leaving. I want to just acknowledge Senator Menendez's extraordinary leadership, not just in the last couple of years. I served with Senator Menendez in the House of Representatives and remember his passionate call within our caucus in regards to the importance of diversity and that we lead by example in our own individual offices. And he's been a champion on the values of America of embracing diversity. And now in his key position on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he's taking that to a level where we can make a real difference globally on who represents America on national security issues. So, Bob, thank you very much for your leadership. I just, first of all, it's good to be with some friends I haven't seen for a while, some people who have been really in the trenches dealing with diplomacy. I will not repeat much of what Senator Menendez said since I didn't hear what he said. But anyway, I just want to make one or two points and then you'll turn it over to the panel. It was about 2 years ago in January when the Democrats on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee requested GAO to do this report on diversity in the State Department. And I must tell you, I started that effort because of what I saw. Just my own observations and working with the people in the State Department showed me we had a problem, because I could see that we didn't have in the ranks of diplomacy the diversity which is the richness of America. When we go internationally, we have an advantage over any other country in the world for a couple reasons. One, we have the prestige, the reputation, the strength to be able to have influence globally on democracy and human rights and anti-corruption and all those principles that this nation stands for. And secondly, we have a population pool that represents a global community. Very few countries in the world have that type of pool of talent that we have here in America. So it was obvious to me that we were not taking advantage of the opportunities we had to advance American values globally because of the lack of true diversity within our State Department. Now, it goes to the ethnicity, it goes to race, it goes to gender, it goes to sexual orientation, it goes to all of the richness of America. If we're going to have the type of influence globally that we need to have. And the stakes could not be higher today. The world is literally heating up. We know that on climate change. But the politics of the world is heated up. A lot of countries where we thought we were making advancements, we've seen a lot of backsliding. I just left the group talking about the Rohingya population in Burma. We see another genocide in our lifetime. America's diplomacy needs to be front and center and at full strength in these challenging times. So the GAO report came back. It's being released, I believe, today. It shows what I think all of us understood. Have we made progress over the years? Yes. Are where we need to be? No. Do we have enough diversity in promotions? No. Do we have enough promotions at the higher ranks? No. Enough diversity to higher ranks? No. Can we do something about it? Yes. So I've introduced legislation with some of my colleagues that will provide the game plan for our national security agencies, which include, of course, the State Department, but includes also our other national security agencies, that they have a game plan, a commitment, leadership support, and periodic reviews, including exit interviews, to see how we're doing, and recruitment to make sure we get the diversity that we need within the State Department. This can be done. We just need a commitment of our leaders to make it happen. Will they do it? I think they want to do it, but there's a lot of things on their plate. How do we make this more of a reality? By filling this room. And this room is filled. Your interest in this and your focus on this, because there's a lot of issues out there. Your focus on this can make a big difference today and tomorrow for America's national security. So I'm just proud to join you here today. You have an incredible panel. Thank you for taking the interest in this subject. It's in our national security, and we can do much better, and we will do much better. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you all for joining us this morning. My name is Michael Schiffer. I work for Senator Menendez and the Democratic staff on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Please don't hold my maleness or paleness against me. We are very lucky, as both Senator Menendez and Senator Cardin said, to have a really top-notch panel here this morning to unpack the new GAO study and then talk about efforts that the State Department, Congress, and the nation as a whole can make to address some of these troubling patterns and the lack of diversity and inclusivity in our national security workforce. I will introduce them to you, starting with my immediate left, Ambassador Gina Abercrombie Winstanley, who is a career member of the Foreign Service, who worked on the National Security Council staff, served as our Consul General in Jeddah, and was our ambassador in Malta. To her left is Jason Baer, who's the director of the International Affairs and Trade Office at the Government Accountability Office, and it was Jason's shop that did the lift on the report that we're here to discuss today. To his left is Ambassador Marie Carmen Aponte, who's our former Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs and our ambassador to El Salvador. And then lastly, Julie Nutter, who's also a career member of the Foreign Service and currently serves as the Director of Professional Policy Issues at the American Foreign Service Association. We thought we would start out with Jason to provide an overview and walk us through the GAO study, and then turn to the other panelists for their perspectives and comments.
Well, thank you, Michael, for a nice introduction. And I have to say, starting out, I'm humbled by the remarks that we got from Senator Menendez and Senator Cardin and their commitment to these issues. And I'm humbled by the amazing audience that we have here in the packed room. And I appreciate all the interest in not only our report, but also the remarks of the other panelists. And third, and certainly not least, I'm humbled to be on a panel of such distinguished individuals who've served the country amazingly well. So now we get to the boring stuff where I talk to you about all the data that we looked at the State Department. And so I think a lot of you have the slides, but we'll just walk through them individually here. The first slide is just a little bit of background, not a lot of which is going to be new to you, and that is, as both Senators Menendez and Cardin talked about, concerns about diversity and the demographics at the State Department are not new, they are longstanding. You can look at a variety of State Department documents and you see in the written word a commitment to improving diversity and an acknowledgement that in order to literally be the face of the world to the rest of the country, we need to reflect the rich citizenry that we are blessed with in the country. And third, we do talk a little about a lot of data here, and so just as a recollection, there are about 23,000 people in the State Department, Civil Service, and Foreign Service, and that's what we focused on in this review. Moving on to slide 3 is just a brief explanation of our research objectives for the report that we're releasing today. First, we looked at the demographic composition of the workforce from 2002 through 2018. Second, we really drilled down to look at promotion outcomes for various demographic groups. And then third, we did a little more qualitative work looking at the extent to which the State Department has identified barriers to diversity in its workforce. On slide 4 is an explanation of our methodology. There were some complicated pieces, but we did a few things. We did look at the demographic characteristics of more than 40,000 personnel at the State Department from 2002 through 2018. On the promotion side, we did 2 kinds of analysis. We did a descriptive analysis, and we also built a more sophisticated statistical model where we adjusted some of those data in order to take account for a variety of other factors other than race, ethnicity, or gender that could affect promotion. I should pause and just say that while we do have some powerful results here in the work that we've done, our analyses don't necessarily completely explain all the reasons that there could be for differences in promotion outcomes. And as a result, we're not trying to establish any causal link between demographics and promotion outcomes. We also spent a lot of time reviewing State Department documents, interviewing state officials, and spending time with State Department employee affinity groups to understand their perspectives and experiences. Moving on to slide 5, this is the data that we got into a little bit. The key message and the key takeaway at the beginning is that the overall proportion of racial or ethnic minorities, as Senator Menendez highlighted, has grown a little bit, but the experience is uneven. So as Senator Menendez highlighted, the proportion of racial or ethnic minorities at the State Department grew from 28% to 32% over the 17 years we studied. But you did see especially a notable decline in African American representation from going from 17% down to 15% by 2018. So then the question on slide 6 was, well, where are people distributed across the workforce in the State Department? So we looked at, again, both the Civil Service and the Foreign Service. And clearly the message is that the proportion of racial or ethnic minorities was generally much smaller in the higher ranks. Whether you're looking at Civil Service or Foreign Service, you have much greater proportions of concentration at those lower levels, so that by the time you get to the executive levels, we're at 13 or 14% racial or ethnic minorities. Moving on to slide 7, we changed the lens and we looked through the lens of gender. Here, as again, Senator Menendez appropriately pointed out, we saw actually a decline in the proportion of women in the State Department workforce, going from 44% down to 43% by the period of 2018. On to slide 8, again, we looked at the distribution across the workforce. You see, again, the same kind of message that we saw with racial or ethnic minorities, but not nearly as pronounced. That being that the proportion of women was generally smaller in the higher ranks over time. Moving on to slide 9, this is where it gets even a little more complicated when we looked at the promotion outcomes. Again, we did a descriptive analysis where we just looked at the rates of promotion for various groups. Then we built this model where we incorporated 12 additional factors that we thought might influence promotion into the model so that we could compare apples and apples, so that we could look at people who were similarly situated in terms of a variety of factors such as occupation, education, language skills, hardship assignments, the things that I think a lot of people in this room might have an influence on promotion. However, there are various other factors that we weren't able to capture in the model. They may have an impact on the overall results. And we did have to treat the civil service and foreign service differently in our analysis. So then the question is, what did we find? That's where, when you move to slide 10, we looked at promotion outcomes for racial or ethnic minorities, especially in the civil service. So let me just give a brief explanation of how in the world to understand all the numbers up here. I would encourage you to start at that solid line in the middle. If you saw the data all falling in that solid line in the middle, you would have promotion outcomes that were the same for racial or ethnic minorities as you do for whites. So when you see the bars to the left, that means you have lower promotion outcomes. If you see bars to the right, they have higher promotion outcomes. So clearly the message from the data that we looked at, both the descriptive analysis and the statistical model that we built and tested, was that promotion outcomes for racial and ethnic minorities are lower than they are for whites in the civil service. Moving on to slide 11, we flip over to the foreign service as we analyze them separately. Again, we see lower promotion outcomes. We see more of those bars to the left. Interesting, there's a little bit of a switch when you get to the class 1 to executive promotions, and we can talk about people's observations and experiences about that. But you certainly have, through the early and mid-career promotions, lower promotion outcomes for racial or ethnic minorities. When we move on to slide number 12 and we look at gender in the civil service, you see through the early to mid-career ranks, more of those bars on the left. The numbers are not as high or not as pronounced as you saw for racial or ethnic minorities, but most of those numbers are on the left, indicating lower promotion outcomes for women in the civil service. Interestingly, when you then go to slide number 13 and we look at promotion outcomes for women in the foreign service, the data were telling us that you see more of those bars on the right, which meant that there were higher promotion outcomes for women in the foreign service than there were for men. And I think this is one of those issues that I think warrants some discussion and observations about people's individual experience. These are what the data are telling us, but there's always a story behind the data. So why don't we move to slide 14, again, where we looked at some more of the qualitative information to the extent that we could. And I certainly have to give the State Department credit for doing the required EEOC reporting. And they do talk about barriers to some groups. They've identified them, and they've come up with plans for addressing some of them. However, I think if you combine our analysis, some of the State Department's own internal analyses, and the conversations that we had with the employee resource groups, it's clear to us that there are some additional areas that have been highlighted that certainly warrant some additional explanation because they might indicate potential barriers to diversity in the workforce. So what does this all mean? Last slide on number 15. What are our conclusions and our recommendations? We really wanted to emphasize a couple of key points that are takeaways. First is that while the State Department has identified and talked about some of the diversity issues they face, they may have an incomplete picture of their workforce from an EEO perspective and issues that might affect the diversity of their workforce. From our view, the State Department taking some additional steps could help them properly direct their resources. We all know the State Department, especially these days, has limited resources for how to address a variety of issues, this being one of them. And so when you understand and peel back the onion to try to really focus on what are the root causes, what's going on here, it gives them a much better basis for making some of those difficult policy decisions. So as a result, we do have a recommendation to the State Department that the Secretary needs to take additional steps to both identify diversity issues that could indicate potential barriers to equal opportunity in its workforce and then implement those. We did give the State Department the opportunity to review the report and provide comments on it. They reviewed our analysis, and ended up concurring with the recommendation that we made. As a part of our process, we'll continue to follow up with the State Department, and we're happy to come back for the staff and members and provide updates as appropriate. I look forward to the questions and answers.
Before I turn things over to the other panelists, let me just take a moment to thank the GAO and Jason and all of his team for this report. There have been a number of different studies on diversity in the Department of State over the years, but this report really provides us with the most comprehensive data set and really good fine-grained analysis to help us really understand what's going on, which is invaluable for my boss, other members up here, and policymakers as they now consider, now knowing what we know, what do we do about it? And so maybe with that as a segue, let me turn things over to Ambassador Abercrombie Winstanley for her comments.
Thank you, Michael. Can everyone hear me all right? Thank you. All right, I want to thank you for the privilege and opportunity to add my personal insight into our continuing failure to have America's representatives look like America. Without a truly diverse workforce at all levels, we will never be able to devise and carry out the most effective foreign policies for our nation. As a 32-year diplomat, I am proud to belong to a cadre of professional Foreign Service officers who have sacrificed much to serve our country. At the same time, I know we are not the best that we can be. Since I joined the Foreign Service in 1985, I have heard secretaries of state, directors general, and recruiting officers respond to questions about the lack of diversity in the Department of State with the same sentence: "We are not where we should be, but we're making progress." Today, even that bromide is clearly not true. This report makes clear we have not made progress. I cannot do justice to the challenges faced by my esteemed former colleagues in the civil service, and I hope that this conversation continues with someone who is a minority in the civil service to address the challenges that they face. I know that our problems begin early. In spite of a rigorous testing process that brings us smart, highly functional, educated, intelligent, and very often dedicated Foreign Service officers, we do not screen for racist. We do not screen for sexist. And we do not screen for indifference to either of those things. This is a problem that is rooted in the culture of the building, the function of the department. No political appointee at any level alone can change this. The issues that the Foreign Service cares about are clear, and there is both accountability for achieving them and consequence for not. The Foreign Service has its precepts that must be met to rise in the core: success in leadership, substantive knowledge, management, communications, intellectual capability, and interpersonal skills. Judged highly on these, and you will rise. But no one is judged and promoted on their ability to improve the quality of the decision-making because of the diversity of viewpoints and backgrounds that they were able to bring to bear. No one is judged and held back because their team or their office or their section or their embassy lacks inclusion. As this report makes clear, you can still walk into a room in the Department of State and know instantly that the right people are not in the room based on the homogeneity of race and gender around that table. Without accountability for those who select employees up and down the ranks, nothing will change. It will continue to be easy and acceptable to overlook, leave out, and avoid hiring women and minorities. And these valuable employees will continue to stagnate, to grow frustrated, and to leave. No promotion, jobs prospect, professional development, assignment, or any other professional progress or accolade depends on the ability to ensure inclusion and development of minority talent. It's not rocket science. If you want the workforce to care, make it clear that promoting inclusion is necessary. Everyone knows the type of work the department considers career enhancing. The work of diversity and inclusion to strengthen the workforce, to make state as an organization better and more effective, is almost disdained. The ability to improve the department's performance sits in many places, including the Director General's office and individual bureaus. Any perceived responsibility to do so is equally elusive and diffuse. No senior official has the responsibility or authority to focus on this foundational issue or to hold others to account. Progress comes down to personal decisions or serendipity. The title of Chief Diversity Officer at the Department of State is included in the many duties of an unnamed officer in the Office of Civil Rights, which itself is significantly understaffed and underfunded. The department has implemented several programs over the years to help level the playing field for underrepresented minorities, and then allowed these programs to be used as yet another entry point for majority applicants. These programs often falter in the face of pushback or the threat of lawsuits from majority applicants who clearly believe holding 87% of executive positions is not enough. No one wants to undermine the professional Foreign Service by eliminating a healthy ladder to senior positions for any FSO. But there is no accountability in the department-wide, bureau-wide, or individual effort to improve representation. Favors are paid. Favorites are rewarded. The process is opaque and often inexplicable. Many individual officers, majority as well as minority, place inclusion as a priority, but the building often works against such efforts. When I became an ambassador, my first choice for my DCM was a highly qualified African American male. Someone who, unlike me, was familiar with the technical challenges of running a mission. Unusually for ambassadors, the Bureau told me the choice was not mine. The front office assigned the DCM a white male who was the Bureau's choice. I must say frankly that the culture of the building is to assume that minority, particularly African American and Hispanic officers, and sometimes women, are less capable. For example, at the Board of Examiners, it includes officers who are charged with selecting the incoming officers, diplomats. The director of that office in 2016, while we were being trained, stated, and I quote, that African Americans have cognitive difficulties with large amounts of reading material. Many, if not most, Department of State employees believe that not entering the service through the Foreign Service Officer Test means that you haven't or couldn't meet the same standards that real FSOs meet. Many have no idea that there are 9 categories of candidates for the oral exam who do not have to take the written exam prior to entering the Foreign Service. These include Boren's Fellows, AAAS, Truman, and Presidential Management Fellows, among others. Unless you have a meaningful conversation with that rare African American or Hispanic fellow, very few in the department know that Pickering and Rangels are in the only category of fellows that must take the exam. There is a presumption in the department that all white officers took the exam and are therefore worthy of being a Foreign Service officer, and that all Black and Hispanic officers likely did not, and therefore are left wanting. It is a damaging assumption that burdens these incredible, highly qualified officers, and one that the department could easily correct and has not. If you are presumed to have not met the standards, no one will want to hire you, and that goes whether they are majority or minority. We all breathe the same air. We all know that increasing diversity of all kinds among national security professionals improves policy outcomes and ensures that we benefit from all the best talent our nation has to offer. Getting changes to how employees are evaluated is extremely difficult. However, the precepts must be constructed to ensure that employees at all levels know that they must set aside their individual biases for the good of the organization. They must know at all levels that they will be held to account, and if they can't do it, they will not prosper at state. If concrete action focused on accountability is not the result of this examination, that we are finally through with rationalizing and excusing failure at the Department of State, we will be here 20 years from now having this same discussion. I'll stop.
Ambassador Ponte.
I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And as I look around this room and enter the winter of my life, I have such joy to see the diversity of people here today. And it is my hope that the Department of State will look like this at one point and not far off. I hope I haven't died. I appreciate the opportunity because, after all, one of the greatest assets this United States has, it's its diplomatic corps. We are blessed and fortunate to have these dedicated civil and foreign service professionals doing the very hard and difficult work of advancing the interest of the United States abroad. In my view, they do an outstanding job, but it could be much, much better. Before I go further into the comments, I do want to salute Senator Menendez, who has been talking and fighting with these issues almost 3 decades. In fact, his concerns go back to his days at the House of Representatives when he insisted that the Department of State respond to questions on the lack of diversity. The senator has addressed the issue long term, and he has brought others to the table to fight for the same issues. He has recognized that unless there is consistency in the questions asked and pressure brought to bear in improving performance in hiring, and that measures be used to assess and track performance, progress would be non-existent. For that, I thank him. The takeaways from the GAO study confirm what everybody in this room already suspects. The progress has inched along, and it certainly is not enough. A diverse diplomatic corps makes us more effective, efficient, and showcases our strength and uniqueness as a country. It is the smart thing to do, and it is also the right thing to do. It makes us better able to solve tough challenges and better promote American interests and values, especially values. So where do we go from here? In the very short years that I was at the department, 6 of them, the following are examples of things I noted that seemed to be successful. Number 1, the Pickering and Rangel Fellowships. They are a terrific tool to recruit and bring in talented and racially and ethnically diverse candidates. Consisting of 60 fellowships, which are very competitive, allows the department to compete for top talent. It is the best way to ensure our top diplomats are well trained after completing a master's degree by serving in domestic and overseas embassy internships and developing diplomatic skills through mentorship. Senator Menendez, as he himself said earlier, led a very strong and a very assertive defense of this program after recent attempts to curtail it. But I tell you, in my judgment, it is extremely important that we preserve it. The qualification evaluation panels that look at the total candidate have been key in providing broader pools of diversity candidates. These procedures allows the department to go beyond successes on the written and stellar academic records and evaluate potential for succeeding as a diplomat based on life experiences, seasoning, and ability to get results before proceeding to the all-day oral examination. It is a rigorous process that aims to capture key factors that are determinative of success. The department can learn how candidates have shown effective leadership skills, how they have succeeded in building and inspiring and motivating people, how effective they are on teams, and their cultural awareness, their creativity, and track record in the work environment. But there are other areas that I did not think worked as well as I thought the department worked, and that require a little bit more effort. One of them is the unpaid internships. There is a very, very small program for remunerated internships. We should broaden the paid internships programs which will undoubtedly attract more disadvantaged candidates while at the same time broadening diversity. There's simply not enough of those. In order to promote promotions, better mentorship and better sponsorship has to be made available. And my sense is that the only way to do this is by giving a person's tendency and a person's work the correct weight in an evaluation, that they be evaluated on how they are doing on the mentorship, on the sponsorship, and on bringing others, especially the diversity pool, along. And third, there is a need for more professional development opportunities, and the military has done this very well through the professional military education, where there is periodic training required at each step of one's career. A similar program at state would require resources and a training infrastructure in order to provide personnel with the training they need. In other words, on-the-job training is not enough. We need to broaden those opportunities. Finally, I have the sense that the Department of State is not viewed by most of the citizens in the U.S. as relevant. They are off somewhere in an embassy. They are active, but it's abroad. And that it seems so removed from American daily lives. But every single day that I was at that embassy, I saw what the diplomats do for the bottom line of the United States. They help Americans in troubles overseas. They advocate for American businesses and create American jobs via trade agreements. They make the world safer by negotiating nuclear and non-proliferation accords. They facilitate American travel abroad by issuing passports. They promote the rule of law and use aid to help countries develop so that their people don't feel that they have to immigrate. They help mitigate and resolve conflicts. They promote legitimate travel and promote study in the U.S., which helps our economy and our universities. They help in times of natural disasters, and they are front and center during outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics. Boy, oh boy, do we know who was there with Ebola, with the severe acute respiratory syndrome with SARS, and now with COVID-19. It is those Foreign Service officers. They need our support, but we also need to see a broadening of the diversity of the service of those Foreign Service officers. The foreign affairs budget of the United States is about 1% of the budget. We get a lot of bang for the buck. China is investing enormously in their diplomatic service. We cannot afford not to do the same, but even more, if we want American leadership to prevail in the world. Thank you.
And lastly, Julie Nutter with the American Foreign Service Association, and then we'll turn the floor open for questions and discussion.
The American Foreign Service Association takes very seriously the mandate contained in the Foreign Service Act that the Foreign Service of the United States should be representative of the United States. It is contained in law. We believe a diverse and inclusive foreign service projects core American strength. The Foreign Service is healthier and more effective when when it reflects the diversity of America. While we welcome current Foreign Service efforts to promote diversity and inclusion under the leadership of Director General Perez, there is still a long way to go. You've heard the discouraging numbers. Today, in 2020, the Foreign Service Officer Corps is still 81% white. The Specialist Corps is 75% white. Some of us who were around in the 1980s remember a more diverse Foreign Service then. What's more, the senior ranks of the Foreign Service look to be going in the wrong direction. They're becoming less diverse, at least if you look at the last several years. And one of the effects of that is fewer opportunities for, as the ambassador said, mentorship and sponsorship. Those people who can pull folks up from the mid and entry level ranks to become the leaders of tomorrow. So we consider this a danger of slippage to be very serious. We would like to see more diversity to help all of our workforce in the Foreign Service. We would also like to see, and the department is taking some steps toward this, to have unconscious bias training, which we have advocated for several years, be widespread and a normal part of a Foreign Service officer's training. We would also like to see things like, and we have cooperated with the department on this, gender-neutral language. We now have a pilot program at the State Department for meritorious service increases using gender-neutral language. We would like this to continue, and we would like to see more experimentation like that. So we do agree with these efforts. We believe that we have to look at the workforce first. We have to look at the long-term health of the Foreign Service when we're considering the vision set out in the Foreign Service Act of a Foreign Service that looks like America. Thanks.
Thank you. And now we'll open up the floor for any questions or comments that people have. We have some pass-around mics, so please raise your hand if you have a question.
Good afternoon, Leo Cruz, National Security Action. Thank you so much for participating in this panel today. The GAO report kind of had lackluster recommendations. The recommendations that were presented at this panel were wonderful. I'm not familiar with Senator Menendez's bill that who talked about it earlier. I'm familiar with Senator Cardin's bill. These bills have been sitting in committee. These suggestions have been going on for years. What is going to take beyond just filling up a room like this to actually see some action and seeing some structural change happen at the State Department?
I can certainly offer some comments from the perspective of this institution, but I defer to my colleagues for the department itself.
I have some. In addition to the unconscious bias training that I mentioned before and the use of gender-neutral language and experimentation around that, one of the things that we at the American Foreign Service Association sees and what we hear from our members is that perceptions of fairness in the department, in the Foreign Service in particular, are extremely important. And this goes to a core cultural issue. perceptions must be focused on as an area of serious effort within the department. Because we can make structural changes, we can do things like that, but if the underlying perceptions are not changed, there won't be change in the Foreign Service as a whole.
Hi, my name is Robin Gallery Todd, and I work, thank you, in the Office of Human Resources at State Department. I'm a civil service employee, and while I appreciate this wonderful panel here, I wanted to ask the question of, first of all, who was the representative, or was anyone asked to speak or address from the civil service perspective the issues that we see? Because, of course, being in HR, we do see both sides. But there is a civil service side out there that's experiencing the same issues. So that's my first question. Was anyone asked to participate? And then the second question I have is, you talk about perception. What measures are being put in place? We know about the unconscious bias training. We know about the conversations, the open conversations that need to be had. But as the ambassador said, you can quietly still continue to do these things that are unfortunate. What measures are being put in place to remove someone who is not going along with the program, who's not going along to get along, as they say? What is being done to remove performers like that? And those are of your most senior people.
Well, I can certainly speak to the first question, which is that we did seek to get. I'm not going to sort of go into any of the specifics, so I'm happy to talk to you about it afterwards. We did seek to get people that could represent a civil service perspective, as well as a number of different perspectives on the panel. As those of you that have done events know, at a certain point you end up with the panel that you end up with. And, you know, there are always going to be gaps and holes, but the point about making sure that we have civil service voices included in the conversation is certainly one that we understand, we appreciate, and we take very seriously. I mean, again, I can offer a perspective from this institution, which is that you know, we're doing our best from a minority position in the Senate to exercise, you know, all the oversight tools that we can with the Department of State, including holding people accountable when we find out about it, and there are a variety of different ways in which we can try to do that, including, you know, through the Inspector General, through the GAO, and other more direct measures. But ultimately, you know, our role here is as an oversight body, and so we try to exercise oversight. That's not always easy when we don't control the committee chairmanships in the Senate. Our colleagues in the House have a little more success than we do, and we try to exercise, you know, pressure when and where we can, and when we find out about things. But I will not tell you that it's easy or that we're always successful. You know, in my experience across working on the Hill across multiple administrations, you know, every administration is resistant to oversight and helpful suggestions from Congress. Some administrations are a lot more resistant than others.
I think, if I may, I just want to talk a little bit about leadership at State Department. And sometimes I get the sense, and I can see it once having done the service at State for 6 years, that unless there is some kind of sensitivity or openness at the leadership, not much is going to happen. So what does that mean for those of us who are inside? We have a fight inside, and we can't give up. And it doesn't matter who who the leadership is. Some leaderships are worse than others. But that does not mean that we have to give up or that we can't fight the fight from inside. Because somehow, somewhere, there has to be a recognition. And that's why I talked about the appreciation of the citizens for the work of the Department of State. I get the sense that there's no appreciation. We need to do work outside also and educate the citizens as to what we do and why it is so important to have the diversity and the broad representation, and they in turn make them allies in this fight. We need all the allies we can get. This ain't easy. And I dye my hair, which is why you don't see my white hairs, but I've earned a lot of them over the years, fighting in the Hispanic community just to say, look, listen, here we are. And it's unfair, but who said life is fair? We just got to keep up and don't give up. I'm sorry, I get kind of excited about this.
Hi, thank you all for being here. I have sort of an odd question that I don't know if you necessarily have the answer to, but I can tell you from my own experience of even just talking to State Department recruiters, I think some of your best candidates are first-generation kids with strong ties to their countries of origin. But given my family's country of origin, which is a place in the Middle East that is currently banned, I was told that I would just be too much paperwork. And so I wondered if you could address things like the clearance process when you do have strong ties to your country of origin and how that impacts the hiring scheme at State.
Let me tell you something about the paperwork. I'm sorry, Michael.
He was very frank. He was
you
like,
don't have
"You're
to
a great
come from the
candidate."
Middle East. You come from the Caribbean and you're a Cuban spy. So it's well, you know, the vetting that goes on is rigorous, and well, it should be. But at the same time, what we cannot allow it to become is politicized, because that's where it just goes off the rails, and that's another place where people like you who come from different parts of the world can get totally misled. We can't allow that. You have to, if one feels that that's one's vocation, go for it. You can't do it. Persistence is what got some of us through. It didn't matter what the accusations were. You got to take them to the test. Make them vet you.
I guess my bigger question is just the idea that even your recruiters deter those first-generation kids who I think would do so well in the foreign service.
Yeah, I'm really surprised to hear that, I have to tell you.
That's actually like not the first time I was told that. And it was at a national security conference, to be honest. At the NatSec.
Hi, Ashley Simon Jackson. I'm a 2020 Brookings Fellow at the State Department, but here at HVAC MENA Subcommittee. And my question actually is for Jason, more so on the numbers about the career and permanent employees, and just wondering who is encompassed in this number. You know, as I'm sure everyone knows, in 2018, the State Department was during a hiring freeze. And so my first question is, one, are these numbers reflective of the jobs that are on the books or the positions that were currently filled at that time? Because I think you'll see a little bit of a difference if it is the former, not the latter. The second question I have is about the civil service numbers in particular, and I'm wondering if they're reflective of all skill and job codes. Because I think that if you break down those skill and job codes, you will see some stark differences in who is in those positions and what their ethnic, economic, and educational backgrounds are.
So it's a great set of questions, and we love it when people dive into the data. And hopefully I've got good answers for you. So the first one, were we looking at positions that were on the books or people that were actually there? The answer is we were looking at people who were actually there. We were actually looking at the GEMS data where it was personnel files. So that's the first point. On your second question, were we including all the skill and job codes and the civil service side? The answer is yes. What I presented in the slides and a lot of what's in the report is aggregated, but it does include everybody. And we have more refined data, again, that we got out of GEMS, but we just had to aggregate it for the purpose of being able to explain it. But I think, the point maybe that you're implicitly making is there are lessons to learn the further you dive deeper into the data. And I think that's one of the themes that we'd like to come out of the work that we did. You've got to understand exactly what's going on here and what the root causes are to design methods and approaches to kind of addressing those kinds of issues.
And I'll just add on to that we've already started to have some discussions with the GAO about follow-up studies. So if any of you have bright ideas for things that we can task them with, by all means, let us know.
Full employment. Yeah.
Please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Glenn. I've actually worked on the MD 715, Management Directive 715 reports at the State Department. And yeah, you're talking about losing hair, graying hair. It's a really complex task. It's not just GEMS. It's a lot of OPM systems, SF-256 data. So my real question about the generation of the report is, do you have access to the exact reports? The MD 715 is about like thousands of data sets. And are you going to publicly release it? Or does AFSA have access to it? Because the questions are related to breaking down the brackets, breaking down, for example, the ethnicities, the race, the disabilities, not just by one big bucket, but like terminations, awards, monetary, non-monetary. So will that data be available?
So another good question. And honestly, this is not one I anticipated because the report is 140 pages long and I had to fight to get it to be 140 pages long. There are a lot of statistical appendices in the back. So we're not going to release thousands of pages of data. And there is certainly sensitivities that we have to work through with the State Department in terms of what level of granularity in order to protect privacy and things like that. But I would encourage you and any others who've got questions about what's in the data, if you look in the back and all the appendices and the information isn't there, let's have a conversation.
Hi, my name is Eric Boone. I'm actually a 2020 Pickering Fellow, and thank you. I've had the chance to meet some of the Pickering Fellows and Rangel Fellows who are such wonderful people, and these programs are fighting what we see is the current state in the State Department. I wonder, is there any plans to either permanently fund those programs that are so influential and so important to making sure that we diversify the State Department, or perhaps even increasing the amount of funding that goes to those programs?
I can give you a very easy answer from my boss's perspective, which was that if we were writing the legislation and he had the gavel, the answer would be yes. Unfortunately, and this to some degree gets to the question about what we can do to help make some of these changes happen. He doesn't have the gavel. So if we want to make some of these changes happen, we need to make changes happen. Are there?
Yeah, just a quick question. Everybody can use Mike. Okay. Hi, I'm wondering what Ms. Nutter might think in terms of what AFSA might do, because I was kind of intrigued by one of Ambassador Abercrombie Winstanley's comments, and that's the fact that in no part of the written oral exam do we screen against racists and sexists or against people who don't object to those qualities in people who seem increasingly overt about expressing them, and whether there isn't a way to bake that into the cake in terms of the selection of officers. Because when we look at what's happened over the last 30 years, it's clear that it's the institution, and the institution is the collection of humans that are in it. So to me, that's where the problem is, not whether it's a Republican or a Democratic administration, because this is a 30-year problem. So it's the quality of the people that are in it. And it seems to me the core problem is that they don't, despite everything they say and try to do, truly value inclusivity and diversity. So whether it's emotional intelligence you screen for or something where the quality of the human beings we're bringing into the department, because we all know I'm State Department employee as well, we're all smart, but are we quality people?
Just a couple of comments on that. I know that although I did not go through this myself because I took the exam a long time ago, the QEP, the personal essays, are some of those weeding out factors. There is now a number of personal essays that are required. Currently, they're doing it right as you actually take the test. Before you take it, you have to do all these personal essays. I think one of the reasons why that was instituted was to find out a little bit more about the whole person. Mm-hmm. The other issue that I would say is if there is an effort to give unconscious bias training to the BECS examiners, that would definitely help. I can't imagine the State Department is not considering that because the unconscious bias training, I think their purpose is to be widespread in that, and I think that would help that process as well.
I'm going to add on to your comments because I was a BECS examiner, which is how I come by the information I've shared. We had some unconscious bias training, and I'm putting quotation marks out there because the person who was directing it, who is a psychologist who's worked with the Department of State for over 20 years on the test, began the training by saying he did not believe it existed. That's how he began the training. So I think I said in my comments that our problems begin early. And for those who are trained and how we are trained to conduct the Foreign Service exam, speaking very frankly, the point is to be bulletproof from legal action as opposed to being thorough in what the results are. And that was my experience firsthand. So.
Sure.
This is also a question for Ms. Nutter. So I'm at the State Department. I've taken the unconscious bias training, and it's an excellent course, actually. It's a very good course. We had a very good conversation with, a group of colleagues that were in HR. But my question is not the unconscious bias training, but like a conscious bias training, because unfortunately, a lot of this is conscious. And I think it's very comfortable for us to talk about unconscious bias because we all have it. We all have privileges, right? We all have things that we're struggling with emotionally. But conscious bias also exists in the institution. And if it didn't, we would have different outcomes in this report, right? And so, is there any conversation with AFSA and the department about looking at conscious bias training or kind of really having a conversation about misogyny and white supremacy and all of these other topics?
So far, we have been briefed on something the department is doing called the open forums. I don't know, open conversations. I don't know if you've been part of that process, but at least the report was that they uncovered a lot of very, very interesting experiences people have had that were surprising. And I think that's where we come into the conscious bias that sometimes, people are a little shocked when the participants come out with stories. And, in that way, we can address almost the disbelief that people tend to have when you talk about conscious bias. Oh, no, that was decades ago. Well, no, not really. So I think that is one of the things that the department is doing. We were, again, as I say, we're briefed on that because we meet every couple of weeks with DGHR. Mm-hmm. But we can certainly investigate more.
I think we have time for maybe one more question if anybody has one.
that open conversation, and it was very human, very real. The hurt is there. And I think the question, after you're comfortable enough to expose that incident or those incidences that occurred to you, what's next? It's not enough just to expose it. It's like sort of reliving it over and over again. But what's the outcome? What's the end result? When do I have to not be guarded constantly because I see no end result or no conclusion or result as to how not that should not happen again? And always explaining to someone how to diffuse it, deflect it, is one thing. But when does it get to the point where you shouldn't have to because it's not accepted? Yeah, so I think that's where the conversation needs to be, is how to terminate that period.
If I could add one more thing about the examination process for bringing people in that, as an assessor, I found troubling, is that there is a section, I want you all to know, there is a section that deals with respect for diversity and inclusive actions. But the reality is it's not disqualifying if you don't have good stuff there, because everything is weighted. So if you have great leadership of the people you choose to lead, or you have great management skills of the people that you choose to manage, but it's clear that you're not dealing with some other issues, or even if you get a low score on that because how you dealt with it wasn't good. If your scores are sufficiently high on the other parts, you go through. Does that make sense to you all? That is where, in my opinion, a big part of our problem lies, is that you can slide through with no concern at all about ensuring that the entire cohort of the Department of State is moving forward, feels safe to do your very best job. And I believe that needs to be addressed, and that's AFSA and personnel and so on and so forth. But that struck me during my year of being an assessor, that this was a huge, visible problem that was not addressed.
Well, let me thank our panelists for really an excellent and insightful discussion, and also thank all of you. I mean, this is an incredibly important conversation. It's one that, as you heard, Senator Menendez, Senator Cardin, and others in this institution are committed to continuing and to making sure that we're drawing in all the different relevant perspectives that are important. Ideas that you have for things that we can be doing up here legislatively and otherwise, please share with us. I already jotted down a couple of ideas out of this conversation that we're now going to have to go back and revise the bill that we plan to introduce later this week before we introduce it.
Oh, good. I have 7 recommendations to share with you.
But we are open, and we do want to work with you all in helping to continue to move this conversation along and to helping to create the sort of State Department and national security workforce that I think we're all committed to seeing. So thank you all, and thank you.
Can you come work for AFSA on our outreach? Oh, your remarks were great.